Alright, something a bit different for today. Zeiss Ikon this time, an Ikonta. This one has come to me for service, mostly to have the shutter serviced. The shutter in this case is a Compur-Rapid shutter, and the first task is to remove the shutter from the camera. So, normally the best way to do that is to actually close the camera up so that you've got very good access to the retainer ring at the back. Now I'm going to use this tool to unscrew it, and you can see that I've got round tips on there. They almost come to a point, but they're rounded. Now I'm using that instead of these blade type tips for a good reason. And the nice squared off blade type tips would engage better in those nicely squared notches on the retainer ring. But as you rotate it, those sharp edges on those blades are likely to damage the bellows. So I used the rounded ones instead, and with a bit of care this works very well. So I'll just engage that. That is unscrewing, it's a bit stiff. That's it, that's loosened up enough now that I can continue to deal with that. So now I'll open the front of the camera slightly, which allows the bellows to pull away, extend, and I can get at that retainer ring a bit better now. That's fine. I can continue turning that now just with the tip of a pair of tweezers, I think. I'll see. Yep. The aim here is not to damage the bellows or scar anything up too badly. Almost inevitably some of the black paint will end up scratched. But you can always touch that up with a bit of paint afterwards. Probably most. The things you have to be most careful about are first of all to make sure that you do not slip and hit the lens. And secondly, that you do not damage the bellows. So here I have the shutter and lens assembly removed from the camera, and I can inspect it and see what I'm doing to get in here. First there's a shim here at the back. Now that's a thick cardboard shim. You may or may not find shims in that position like that. There's another shim there. It's a paper shim by the looks of it. Seems to be stuck. I'll just see if I can loosen that with a scalpel, just sliding it in underneath. And it just appears to be a bit stuck for some reason. I think it's been, there it is, it's loose. Ideally don't damage those shims, and you do want to put them back. Just looking at the arrangement here of the aperture scale. That's a little bit unusual. I'm not sure how all this arrangement comes off. It might just pull off from the back of the camera. Doesn't appear to want to. It might be held by this screw at the centre. That screw head, the slot in the screw head is quite narrow, appears to have been filed down. It is turning. Right, I can lift that off. That appears to be holding that plate in position. Oh, this side. This side we've got another screw, so I'll take that off. That plate lifts off. So how are they stuck together? Well, the scale with the numbers on it appears to be clipped into place. A little pointer here stops me from being able to pull that off very easily. That's an odd manufacturing technique. See if I can rotate that round past the end. That doesn't look like it. Oh, the scale can be pulled up far enough. I can get that hook unhooked. So those parts can be cleaned. They weren't particularly dirty, but I do like to have all the components disassembled and cleaned. So looking at this rear lens group, it's got a bit of dust and dirt on it. Nothing particularly pronounced. Nothing particularly bad to deal with, I would think. Our front group. Well, the front surround here, the focus scale ring, is attached to the front group with screws that drive in from the outside edges. They're very small screws. They're quite long, and I might need to find another screwdriver to deal with those. So slacken off all three in turn. They're usually not ridiculously tight. That lifted off. So there I have that ring off in one piece. I'll put that to one side. Be careful not to lose those screws. They are very small. Very small screws are a lot of trouble to deal with. Right at the front here, this is the front element that screws into the middle element here, the middle group. And the middle group has a single hole here where you could engage a tool if you had such a tool. I'm going to try a friction tool on here and see if I can turn that, get that off, and likewise I'll use a friction. Oh, they don't need to. The rear group is loose enough that I can just undo that with my fingers. That wasn't really tight enough at all. So the rear group is off, our front group is off. Need to get this centre group out, and I'm going to use a friction tool. In preparation for using the friction tool, I'm just going to remove our pointer here, our focus scale pointer. It's held onto that front plate with 2 small screws, because that's just a folded piece of metal and it would be easily damaged. That allows me good access to this front group, and I'll try using a friction tool on that, which is a rubber stopper. I'm not making much progress. Well, here, as you can see, I've got a hose clip or hose clamp, and between the hose clamp and the outside of that lens group I've got a little bit of flexible rubber material to apply some extra grip, and all I've done is tighten the hose clamp up on that lens, and it allows me enough purchase to be able to loosen that lens, and it didn't take much effort at all. I was able to do that between my fingers, and now the lens is loose and can be unscrewed. You have to be very cautious using that method. If you apply too much force with that hose clip, you can distort the lens tube, and then you'll discover that the front lens group will not turn in the middle lens group. But that's fine. I've avoided that pitfall there. That's all good. So we're down to the shutter. So we have a little half head screw here that needs to be rotated out of position. If I had the right screwdriver here, everything would go much quicker. The correct screwdriver is just a broad bladed screwdriver with the tip reground to leave 2 points to fit into those pinholes, then rotate that lock round 180 degrees to clear the slot. Rotate the lens. The lock ring is just a bayonet, rotating it anti-clockwise releases it. We can lift off our shutter speed control ring or shutter speed cam, and we're into the shutter mechanism. If we find the right tweezers, we'll be in the way laughing. Here we go. So our main drive spring is here. I'm going to unhook that from its post. And this is called the main lever. Even though it doesn't look much like a lever, that's what it's called. And I'm looking at the rest of the shutter now to see, make sure that there is nothing unusual about it, that I recognise all the mechanism and see how it's constructed. So our shutter release lever can come off. In this case it just lifts straight off the post. Our flash sync contact can come out, held by a single screw. This is pressed into the case. Sometimes it requires a bit of work to push it out. In this case it's came out quite easily. This is your 500th of a second or high speed spring. I lift this lever up, it comes out. It's got a return spring here which acts as to lock it into place. We can take that spring out. This little lever latches the shutter in the cocked position. It's held by a single screw. It has a spring on it in this case, which acts against this lever, which is the B lever. That holds the shutter open when the shutter is set to the B position, while you hold your finger on the shutter release. So you can remove that screw from the centre of that. And that is that side of the mechanism plate stripped down as far as we need to at this stage. Next we've got to split the mechanism plate here from the shutter case. The shutter case and the mechanism plate are held together with three screws fitted from the back of the case. And in this case they are very tight. That's better. Those screws are typically identical. And now we should be able to split the case from the mechanism plate. The case holds our diaphragm for the aperture settings. That's a little bit stiff. I can't immediately tell whether that's because of contamination and dirt on those blades, or whether it's because of dried grease underneath the control ring at the back. Now, looking at the state of this, I immediately notice that the screws on this side have been filed down. Now, they've been filed down after this has been assembled. I don't immediately know whether those screws are in some fashion damaged. It's not uncommon to find shutters where these screws have been stripped out, and the only course of action after that is to rivet them over. I don't know if I'll find that that is the case. If I suspect that there's going to be a problem there, I'll deal with taking this apart in a slightly different fashion than normal. We'll pop that to one side. Here are the shutter blades on the mechanism plate. As you can see, they're already a little bit displaced. They've bounced out. See if I can reseat them. Usually that's futile. Yeah, they're all sitting correctly in position at the moment. In the order that the blades are fitted in here is usually the same. One of these blades has an extra hole here which does nothing except let you know that that's the first blade to be fitted. It's fitted here. So that's blade number 1 in this position. You can see that spot relative to our speed train. It's by that rivet head there. Blade number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 and number 5. So they're fitted in an anti-clockwise sequence like that. These blades, looking at them, it's a little bit marked. I'd say that they'll probably require some polish with Brasso metal polish in order to get those blades looking nice and shiny again. In an ideal world, these blades would probably go back in exactly the same position that they came from. In practice, particularly if you are going to polish the blades, there'll be no marks on the blades, nothing to disguise, and as a result they can go back in any order you like, as long as the first blade, the one with the extra hole, starts in this position over here. Oh, so far so good. That's the mechanism plate stripped, or stripped so to this extent. This lever here actuates the blade actuating ring under here. You can see as I flip it backwards and forwards it swings that. Now that would pivot the blades in and out. So there's a little return spring on this there, and I'll swing that out the way. It's held by a single screw. There may or may not be a very, very thin shim washer under that screw. There wasn't in this case. On the lever, this little post on the lever, that's got a little sleeve over it, an insulating sleeve. That's where it contacts the flash contact. On this side, we have 3 screws holding the retainer plate. Typically one of these is longer than the others. And in this case, it's this one. Now it looks to me like someone's made a mark on the mechanism plate there, probably to remind them that's where the long screw fitted. That can come off. Here's the blade actuating ring, the retainer plate and the mechanism plate. Now typically this is as far as I strip the mechanism plate down. I don't advise you to remove the retard gear train from the mechanism plate unless you have a very good reason to do so. And the reason for that is simple. It's a bugger to get it adjusted correctly so the speeds will work correctly. So I leave it on there, I clean it on the mechanism plate, lubricate it lightly with a bit of graphite powder on the mechanism plate and reassemble the shutter. You can probably see on this plate there's a lot of dirty yellow grease here, some staining here. Apart from that, nothing particularly memorable. All that old grease has to come off. It's not helping anything. The speed train certainly needs to be flushed with naphtha and worked to get rid of any dust and dirt, dried lubricants or any other rubbish that's in there. And the blades of course need to be polished. I'll pop that to one side. I want to turn my attention to this aperture diaphragm mechanism here. Now by undoing these 2 screws I should be able to remove the setting ring from the back of the shutter. That unscrewed very well, it may not be damaged. And likewise the second screw came out. No, that appears to be fine. I was concerned that these screw holes might have been stripped out and the screws riveted over, but that was not the case. I'll pop those 2 screws down there with it. And here we have the retainer plate and the diaphragm blades. Now I can tell now, because I haven't got this ring on the back to provide extra friction, I can tell from the way this moves that that diaphragm is unusually stiff and certainly needs to be disassembled and cleaned. There must be contaminants on those blades, typically oils, some dust probably. The retainer plate here is held in place with 3 screws. On this particular shutter they appear to be identical. On some later shutters you will find that one of those screws is a countersunk head screw and the other 2 are not. You need to make sure that the countersunk head screw goes back in the right position of course. Right, we can tip this out. So we have our shutter case which needs to be cleaned. Remove any contaminants, old grease, dirt, dust and other rubbish. This is the moving ring that rotates as you change the aperture settings, and this of course as it rotates it pivots the blades and if we tip those blades off there, you'll see that they're in a nice neat rosette. All of the blades are over the blade at one end and under the other blade at the next end. It's quite normal, they will come out in a rosette like that. It doesn't mean there's anything unusual about that. They are sort of woven together. Of course, they will be separated and cleaned. And I'm having a look at these now. And the first thing I notice about these is that they have a big notch in the centre of the blade. Now that's a feature of some of the Compur shutters. Typically they are an odd number of blades in that condition, and the other blades are just plain. I've never been able to tell exactly why they did it. I suspect it was something to do with it has to be either for some ease of assembly in the factory, or alternatively it was to reduce the friction between the blades so that they slid over each other more easily. As I say, it's some shutters you will find 3 blades with notches in them, 5 blades or 7 blades with notches in them, and typically 3 or more without notches. Sometimes I've found it convenient to start assembling the shutter with the blades without notches. It makes it easier to swing the blades back over when you're doing the final assembly of the diaphragm, which you will see fairly shortly. It's not an awful business, but it takes practice to get good at it. So our shutter here is all in little pieces. Everything needs to be cleansed, get rid of all the dirt and filth, and then I'll reassemble it. I'm going to start cleaning these diaphragm blades. Now you have to be very careful cleaning diaphragm blades. Unlike the shutter blades, they have a rivet at each end which forms the pivots, and it's easy to damage the blade by catching the cotton bud on those rivets. These blades, of course, are exceptionally easy to damage because they have that large notch in the centre, which robs them of a fair bit of strength at that point. It makes them easy to damage by bending. So I'm just checking this blade now. It's still got quite an obvious mark in the middle. I don't typically polish diaphragm blades. It's just too fraught because of the pivots and the risk of damaging the blade by catching a cleaning cloth or a cotton bud on them. I do not typically polish them. I just clean them like this. Now, one thing worth noticing is that these blades are not symmetrical. The position of the pivots at the ends of the blades are different at one end of blade than the other. So I'll get this one in position. It might be hard to notice on your screen, but the pivot on this blade is closer to the middle centre line of the blade than it is at this end here. At this end here it's closer to the corner of the blade. It's worth making a note of that because it's important when we come to reassemble the diaphragm that they all get put back in the correct orientation, otherwise the diaphragm won't work properly. So as I clean these blades, I'll pop them to one side and then I can assemble them all together. So the marks that are on these blades, typically it's scuff marks just from the metal having passed over the other blades. Also there'll be some staining there from contaminants like oil that have settled on the blades at some stage. And you may get, if you're very unlucky, a fingerprint from some previous repairer. Now I can see something of that nature just here. That looks like the remnant of a fingerprint to me. You probably do without things like that. If you get fingerprints on them, typically they etch themselves into the surface of the blade just through a corrosion process, really. And it's certainly something you want to avoid. So we've got 10 blades in this diaphragm. And I have to lay them all out the same way so that I know how they'll go. Makes it much easier when I come to reassemble them. So I'll just work through, clean these 10 blades, then I'll show you how I reassemble the diaphragm.